After the Missouri crisis, there was an interim in American history in which sectional tensions, those North-South conflict, it was somewhat superseded by a shared national enthusiasm for expansion. But ironically, it was expansion that would lead to the final crisis that brought about the Civil War. In the mid-19th century, the cause of democracy seemed to be on a winning streak. In America, Jackson's Democratic Party was ascendant. In Europe, various movements like Young Italy or the Young Hegelians, which, by the way, included the young Karl Marx, in Germany, were pushing for an end to undemocratic government in Europe and seeking to establish democratic republics similar to the United States. Many voices in America began calling for a movement to extend the principle of democracy, both metaphorically and literally. And you can see this as sort of part of that broader trend that we discussed when we talked about the Great Awakening of enthusiasm for change, enthusiasm for growth, enthusiasm for remaking the world. And there are more connections that we're going to discuss a little later on in the lecture. So some of these people who were sort of fired up about a sort of inner cultural revolution in America was this group that called themselves the Young Americans. And their favored outlet was this magazine in New York called the Democratic Review, edited by a guy named John O'Sullivan. O'Sullivan, among others, wanted to cultivate a uniquely American democratic style in the arts and literature that would throw off old, stodgy European influences from American culture. The Democratic Review published some writers who are now regarded as among the greatest in American history, such as Nathaniel Hawthorne and Walt Whitman. But they also had political ideas. O'Sullivan had some very particular political ideas that went along with his artistic tastes. And one of the biggest ideas that he had was favoring expansion, particularly expansion of democracy, democratic institutions, believing that ultimately the destiny of America's democratic institutions was to spread over the world even and bring liberty to people around the world. And it was O'Sullivan that coined a term you might have heard called manifest destiny. And you're going to read the editorial in which he coined that term, referring specifically to the manifest destiny of the American people to have extend their institutions, extend their institutions across the entire continent, and extend political liberty as he envisioned it across the entire North American continent. And this term, manifest destiny, was coined in an editorial that was about the issue of Texas annexation. So what does that mean? Well, in 1821, Mexico became independent from the Spanish Empire. It was a long process culminating in 1821. And this land of New Spain, conquered from the Aztecs originally and other native groups, is now inherited by this new state of Mexico, the nation of Mexico. A lot of it, particularly the territories that reach into the modern United States, were not heavily settled or developed. In fact, the real rulers of a lot of the Spanish territory in North America were Indians, especially a group whose military ability really kind of surpassed that of any other group in North America at the time, the Comanches. Although they were not officially recognized as a state or as an empire by Mexico or by the United States, there was a de facto Comanche empire that historians call Comancheria in parts of today's Texas and New Mexico, but having an influence and a power that extended far beyond just its core. The Comanche had once been a fairly weak tribe living at a modest subsistence level, but their discovery of horses, which had not existed on the continent before they were brought by the Spanish, this discovery changed their status remarkably. They were some of the most effective mounted warriors in history, and they used this ability to create a tribute-extracting empire that wouldn't really be fully defeated until after the Civil War. The Comanche raided, traded, and took tribute from Americans, from Mexico, and from other tribes. The area we now know as Texas had few non-native settlers, and Mexico was happy to encourage Americans, they called Anglos, to immigrate to that region, especially to provide a buffer between Mexico's core territories and the Comanches. So gradually the population of the area grew, and particularly a group that was attracted to it was Southern slave owners looking to expand the land under cultivation of their plantations. Eventually, the Mexican government grew wary of the number of foreigners now inhabiting this part of their country, and they made several moves to sort of clamp down on the Anglo takeover of the region. They moved to abolish slavery. They moved to cut off immigration, although immigration continued illegally, and to impose Catholicism on settlers. We're going to return to this issue of Catholicism in a bit, but just try to remember, as a theme we've discussed throughout this course is a sort of antagonism to Catholicism and a way that English settlers and later Americans had of defining themselves in opposition to Catholicism and associating Catholicism with tyranny. So consider that as a factor here. All this provoked conflict. The conflict was worsened when Mexico is taken over by the General Antonio Lopez de Santa Anna, who centralized power in Mexico. It had formerly been more democratic. He made the government more autocratic. He abolished the kind of states' rights, self-government that had existed in Mexico with constituent republics having their own power, and centralized power. And many people rebelled against this in Mexico. Different provinces rebelled, wanted their own self-governance back. But Texas, primarily composed of immigrants from America, was one of the states that rebelled, and they actually were able to fight for and win independence from Mexico. So for a time, you had an independent nation called the Republic of Texas, primarily composed of immigrants from America, existing where modern-day Texas is. Now, the question that this raised, and the question that the editorial was about, was could this independent nation of Texas join the United States as a new state? This issue is very controversial. One reason you might recognize it as controversial is because this was clearly going to be another slave state. And as we know, the addition of slave states in the West was a subject of a lot of concern. But there's also the issue that it's going to raise the specter of dragging America into Texas's conflict with Mexico and bringing America into a war with Mexico. President James K. Polk became president in 1845, and he forced the issue. Polk is not as well remembered today as he might be, considering how important he was historically, and considering how he was viewed in his day. He was considered a very exciting president. He represented manifest destiny and young America as much as any politician. He was at that time, I believe he was the youngest president to hold office at that time, and he sort of made a big thing out of this, out of his youth. And he was an ardent supporter of expansion. He's widely seen as deliberately goading Mexico into war with the United States by first recognizing Texas as a state and then sending troops into disputed territory across the border of that state. And in 1846, he got the war he was looking for when Santa Anna's troops fired on U.S. soldiers in the disputed region. Now, this war was highly controversial because some saw it not as a defense of liberty and freedom, but as a calculated land grab, the kind of imperial aggression that Americans like to dissociate themselves from. And there were many people who spoke out in opposition to it. But there were also many people who were enthusiastic about it. And one feature in this enthusiasm was religion, particularly that evangelical fervor that we've talked about, this sort of new upsurge in enthusiastic Protestant Christianity. One preacher in particular, this guy Lyman Beecher, who you're going to be hearing the name Beecher again in a subsequent lecture, as you'll see. But this preacher Lyman Beecher, I rhymed, was a big supporter of the idea that Protestantism had to win the West, and that Catholicism was a threat to America's future on the continent. So a lot of people viewed the war with Mexico rather, as a kind of continuation of of the English American conflict with Spain and with France. It was about winning this territory for freedom and democracy, which in their minds is very associated with Protestantism. And Mexico, which is in some ways this very European-like state. Santa Anna calls himself the Napoleon of the West. He wears this, kind of brocaded military uniform. It's a very religious Catholic nation. It's autocratic, and it seems almost like sort of the last foothold of kind of old reactionary Catholic tyranny empire on the North American continent, and we need to overcome that influence and win this land for freedom and liberty. There's this passage that I came across that's interesting in this regard. It's a passage from a soldier in the Mexican-American War describing a battle that he took part in and describing what the Mexican forces appeared like. This is the Battle of, what is it called again? Buena Vista, which is a turning point in the war in which the American forces, which are outnumbered by the Mexican forces, prevail, although the Mexican forces were very exhausted, having marched hundreds of miles across the desert. So it maybe wasn't as much of a David Goliath story as they made it out to be. But anyway, this Battle of Buena Vista, which took place on George Washington's birthday, in which the American army prevailed, this soldier gives an account of it that I think gives you some perspective of how some Americans saw or tried to portray Mexico at this time. This is what he said. Their cavalry was magnificent. Some 6,000 cavaliers, richly caparisoned in uniforms of blue faced with red, with waving plumes and glittering weapons, advanced towards us as if they would ride down our little band and finish the battle at one blow. They formed in one line with their massed bands in front, and when a procession of ecclesiastical dignitaries with all the gorgeous paraphernalia of the Catholic Church advanced along the lines, preceded by bands playing a solemn anthem. And he says the air was so clear we could see their very movement. And he describes the contrast between this army and the American army, in which he says there were no religious figures, no preachers present. So he's portraying the Mexican army as this kind of grand, theocratic army, and it evokes, in some sense, the past, the sort of decadent past that the young, sprightly, freedom-loving power of America is going to overcome. That's the kind of the image that is portrayed by supporters of this war. Now, if Polk's goal was to grab land, he certainly succeeded, because the war ends in 1848 with a peace treaty, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, that adds more territory to the United States than it had seen since the Louisiana Purchase. Basically, all the Western United States we know today came into this country through this war, and the treaty had ended at California. A lot of Colorado, New Mexico, Nevada, Wyoming came in from this war. These are not the core areas of Mexico. They were relatively sparsely inhabited, but their loss represented a tremendous loss of opportunity if we think about all that territory has added to our wealth as a country. All of that was lost to Mexico, and that is a loss that is certainly still resented to this day. But for America, all this new territory is in some sense a mixed blessing. Before the Mexican-American War, the great poet Ralph Waldo Emerson, had warned, "America will conquer Mexico, but it will be as the man who swallows the arsenic, which will bring him down in turn. Mexico will poison us." And as it turned out, he was right, because as soon as all this land came into the country, it raised a very difficult question. When all this land is made into states, will these states be slave or free? And it was this question that would finally shatter the uneasy compromise over Missouri and plunge the nation into civil war. And we'll talk about that in the next video. Thank you.